We are starting at the point of having a base image drawn on watercolor paper. And in my case I use the tracing paper and graphite paper to transfer the image, but if you are fine with drawing things freehand, you can pick up a pencil and use a pencil to draw the image freehand on your piece of destination paper to get things started. So in this particular case, we are going to do crayon resist watercolor as I look around to figure out where I put the crayons. There they are. They were hiding behind the brushes. So for crayon resist watercolor, you need two main things. You need crayons and you need watercolors. Let's try to move this a little more out of the way. Alright, so we have got crayons, and let me just pull this open. We've got watercolors. And I suppose I need to get the brushes closer. There we go. Well, I suppose we'll pull this down so you have a little better sense of what the watercolors are that I'm working with. Just looking at the screen, trying to make sure you can see everything. Alright, so the idea with crayon resist watercolors, sorry, as I knock my crayons over. The idea with crayon resist watercolors is that crayons are made of wax, and a wax layer is something that the watercolor will not stick to. So if we make lines with the white crayon, they'll be pretty much invisible to the person looking at the screen, and they will resist the watercolor getting to the paper, so they will leave those white lines without much effort from us. And that creates a lovely effect to have white lines along the edges of things. So with crayon resist watercolor, you have a starting image that you draw in pencil, or that you trace with graphite paper, and then you go over those lines with a white crayon, which forms the resisting barrier, and then you paint things with your watercolor paints, and that ends up creating a lovely scene that has the white lines. And it especially works in this particular case with the barn, if I show you the source image here, because the lines are in fact white in this barn. It's a red barn with white lines on it, so the white is particularly appropriate in this particular case. So let's put this under here if we can be able to find the guidelines. I suppose we'll move that there so that the pen is not casting brushy shadows across everything. Alright. So crayon resist watercolor paints with the Daniels Farm. So we're going to start with our white crayon, and we're going to trace over the lines that we've made in our pencil sketch phase of things. Now, when you are putting on white crayon lines onto a white piece of paper, it is hard to see where you have drawn and where you haven't drawn, because the white just blends into the white. So it's good to start on one end and to work your way over to the other end. So we will start over here with the tree, and we're just tracing the line with the white crayon. This white crayon is not going to be super precise. Crayons, you know, I haven't sharpened this in a while, so it is sort of a rounded edge, But that's okay, because the purpose here is to create a fairly thick line, and one that has a lot of wiggles and crenellations in it. So that's part of what I like about it, and I suppose that's part of what I like about watercolors in general, is that it encourages you to just be happy with what you have, to be mindful and relaxed, and to let life go the way that it's going to go. You know, especially when you're doing watercolor things, the colors and paints can swirl and move where they want to at times, and I like that as a reminder to be relaxed about what is happening and to find ways to be happy with whatever happens. Alright, so we got a tree. Get the edge of this building over here. So like this, I'm going to use the back edge of the crayon because that's a little sharper to draw this hitching post. In general, I'm being fairly rough and casual about these lines that I'm doing. I am fine with an impressionistic, soft version of the scene. If you want to take hours and be incredibly precise and have your crayons super sharpened, then you could certainly do that. It is your painting, and you could do it any way you want. Alright. The roof line. It's funny how we get used to the things that are around us in our own world. Having grown up in New England, we come to think of it as being very natural that roof lines are sloped because they have to be that way to keep the snow from settling and collapsing the building. But there are, of course, many parts of the world that have these snow problems and their roofs are flat. And to my mind, flat roofs are unusual, and I'm sure to people in parts of the world without snow that all of these pitched roof lines are unusual. So it goes to show how everything is relative. The things that are normal and natural for you could be things that are completely strange and unusual for other people. That's part of the fun of painting scenes from different parts of the world, is how things vary from each other. Right, so the trees behind the farm. Alright, so we have traced with crayon the key lines of the scene, and since they are white, it is hard to see them, especially since I made these graphite lines fairly dark so that you could see them. But if you hold your piece of paper at an angle to your light source, whatever it is in your house, you should be able to see a shine, and I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but I can see it myself. You should be able to see a shine wherever the crayon got put down, and that way you can make sure you got everywhere. Alright, so I believe that I have put down white crayon everywhere that white crayon is needed. Let me move that a little closer to me. Alright, so we have gotten through the graphite paper tracing part of this, and we have gotten through the drawing the lines with the crayon part of this. Alright, so now we're going to get to the watercoloring part. So we're going to do the watercoloring in 2 steps. The first step is that I'm going to put in the background and the foreground with wet on wet, which means I'm going to get the paper wet in those areas, and then I'm going to put in wet paint so that it spreads and relaxes. And the reason I'm doing it that way is because it'll give a soft, gentle feel to those areas, and they will be slightly out of focus. And I'm sure you've seen pictures where like there's a flower in sharp focus in the front, and then the background is all soft and fuzzy. And that effect helps to help focus your eye in on the main topic area that you want the person to look at. So we're going to do the same thing here. Alright, this is like what brush to use. There we go. Alright, so I'm just using a big general brush to be able to put the sky in to start with. So when you're doing on wet, start by getting your brush wet. And you get the paper that you're going to fill in with the generic color wet. So I'm going to paint up to the lines of the house and the tree and stuff, but I'm not going to paint inside those buildings because I do not want those buildings to be the blue of the sky. So I'm painting everywhere that I want to be sky blue. I'm just painting them with water. I'm creating the base water area. Now when I'm going to the edge of this black line, I'm actually going to the edge of the crayon. So there's a crayon line creating a boundary for all of these areas. Now this house here is very dry, so as I'm putting water down, it is pretty much drying right away, so you may have to go over this 2 or 3 times before the paper gets wet enough that it actually stays wet for me to be able to do the wet and wet painting. Alright, I'm getting there. When you are watercoloring, keep in mind that in general when watercolors are displayed, they are framed in mats because you want a bit of distance between the surface here and the glass. You don't want to press this right up against the glass. And a purpose of a mat is to provide vertical space between the glass that's on top and the paper below by having that edging of the mat so that there ends up being airspace between the two of these things. So that mat is going to cover up a little bit of the edges, so try to keep a margin of unimportant painting in those edge areas because the edges are going to be getting cut off by the mat. So don't put the barn right up to the edge of the piece of paper, I guess is what I'm saying. Always have things that can be covered on the edges, so just random tree edges or other kinds of background images or sky. Alright, so I think that I have gotten all of the blue sky area wet enough that it's going to work with this wet on wet technique. So just using water here to get everything wet, and then I have to choose a sky color. And how about this color today? So I'm just getting a little bit of paint, and I don't have to do anything too precise because it is going to spread all by itself throughout all of this wet area, because I'm sure you've seen if you drop a little bit of color into a glass of water or just something of water, it spreads out by itself. It billows and goes wherever the water is. And the paint here is doing the exact same thing. It's getting into this water and then it's just spreading out wherever the water is. So it creates these soft shapes which represent clouds. It gives a nice soft feel to it. And you can also see, I believe, how it's getting to the edge and then stopping. That's because it doesn't go meandering into dry areas of the paper. It just goes wherever the wet areas are. And part of why it's stopping is that there's that crayon layer there that it's running up into. And that's sort of neat because the crayon layer is not a hard line area. crayon is sort of a wiggly sort of substance. So if you looked really closely at those lines, they are not hard edge lines, they are soft and have crenellations in them. And I enjoy that aspect of it. Alright, so you can do more paint in one area and less paint in another area, but it's all going to flow and move where it wants to. So you're just creating a general impression of a sky here. And all of those natural lines in there help give that realistic view of what many times a sky looks like. Because many times the sky has layers of clouds, different levels of lightness and darkness. And there's a little areas in here under the tree. Alright, so take a look at your painting. Make sure you got things blue everywhere that you intended for them to be blue. And the background is not the focus. The background is just to provide something for the barn to be up against. So you don't have to be too picky, depending on what your intentions are for your image. But you can just make a general thought. And since this is wet, if you hold it, it'll move around. So you can always do that as well. But since it is dry in this house, this is already starting to dry. So I need to do this stage fairly quickly to make sure that I have everything move and settle the way that I want it before it starts to dry. Because once it starts to dry, then it is no longer moving at all. One of the things that happens when watercolor paper gets wet is that it can bend and buckle. Some people tape down their watercolor paper. That's a way to handle it. Some people pre-wet their watercolor paper, so it goes through that bending and buckling stage. Why I'm commenting on that is that the buckle created a darker ridge right over the farmhouse, or the barn. And I'm just using my brush to drag color away from that area so it's not quite so obvious that that was happening. So the curling and buckling is a normal thing that watercolor paper does. If it concerns you, then you can, like I said, pre-wet the paper, or you can tape down the paper so that it stays more still. I just let it do what it wants to do because I like things to be relaxed and calm. And it adds to the sense that this was a natural handmade piece of art versus a computer generated piece of art from an AI computer. Alright, I think I've taken care of much of the line problem. And again, this is just a blue background, so there's no need for me to be obsessing about the blue. It is okay the way it is. So step 1, getting a blue background in for the sky. Step 2, we'll be getting a brown background in for the foreground, or foreground, a brown color in for the foreground. Now I did have thoughts of adding a couple chickens in here, which would probably go down in this area. With watercolors, the colors generally don't sit on top of each other. If you painted one color and then painted a second color, what you're actually doing is looking through the paint to the paper, and then the light's bouncing back out off the paper, and that gives it that glowy feel to it. So if I painted everything brown and then tried to paint yellow on top of it, those would be yellow-brown chickens, and that's not quite the effect I was going for. So instead, you need to leave holes where you want to make the chickens, or you need to paint the chickens first so that you can then paint around it with the brown, or whatever color you are painting. So I think I'm going to paint the yellow chickens first. That way I decide where they're going to be, and then I will paint the brown ground around those chickens. But like I said, you can't just paint this whole area a darkish brown and then be able to paint yellow splotches on top, because watercolor makes layers out of colors, and you would have a yellow splotch on top of a brown splotch and it would still be quite dark. So I'm going to call up a picture of chickens. And they're just going to be little splotches, but I still like my little splotches to be reasonably chickeny shaped. Alright, I have some splotches of what I think I want to do. Now, interestingly, I was going to make yellow splotches, but apparently chickens are mostly brown. Brown against brown is not going to work very well. So I'm going to have to make them into white. I think I was thinking of baby chicks as being bright yellow. But adult chickens are brown or white, or they've got some black ones. But I think we'll go with white, maybe white and like one black one. Alright, so then that has another question. Normally you don't paint white on a watercolor. Normally you let the paper itself be the white and you just paint around it to show that something is white. So there's no way to paint white, and I want to show where the shapes are going to be. I'm going to draw in little light shapes. They're sort of chickeny. I suppose I can give them a few little yellow chicks. Another one over there. Alright, so now we've got 3 chickeny shapes. I know it'll be hard to see them, but that's sort of my point, is that I don't want these things to stand out too much. I just want to be the sense of some chickens. And I don't want them to be dark brown, because then it would be hard to see them against the background here. Alright, so I guess we don't really want to do too dark of a brown here for the farmyard. We'll go with sort of a lightish brown. Alright, so first we're going to rinse off the brush, and then I'm also going to do this foreground in wet on wet, so it's just this soft, gentle feel to it. So again, with a nice clean brush, I'm going to just fill this lower area in with water to start with. But the tricky part is I get over here. I want to paint around these little splotchy areas I made to represent chickens. And there isn't a lot of detail in those chickens because the idea is not to have these chickens be the focus. They're just going to be little splotches to sort of indicate that chickeny shapes are out here. And this is already starting to dry. That's what happens when your house is very dry. These little chick shapes so they do not turn brown. It can be sort of tricky to figure out what you have painted with water and what you haven't painted with water because they don't look any different, but if you put your head to the side you should be able to see where it's shiny versus not shiny. Alright, I think I've gotten everywhere. Now we'll get some brown. Just put in splashes of the brown, and again it will spread all by itself amongst this wet area. And it will spread out to everywhere that's wet, but if you want some areas to be a little darker, you can put a little more paint there. And that area should stay a little darker. If you want some areas to be a little lighter, you could put a little less paint there. Because when there's less paint, more of the light of the room gets through the paint to the paper and bounces back off the paper. And that's really what you're seeing, is that reflected light off of the piece of paper that you're working with. Alright. Get in around these little chick shapes. Around those chicken shapes. It's back. Kitty, the painting is wet now, so I can't really have you climbing over the painting because then you get little paint footsteps all over everywhere. Yep, you can stop nuzzling the phone now. Thank you, sweetie. Sweetie. Yes, you're a very good kitten. Very good kitten. Come on, sweetie, come over here. Good kitten. Alright, so now I look for places where I didn't quite reach as far as I wanted it to reach. Oh, the cat is back to give a little chew to the edge of the brush. Those brushes clearly need to be chewed on. Is that a nice chew toy for you? No, I specifically bought the catnip sticks so that she would have something to chew on that was not a brush. But that is apparently not nearly as much fun as coming while I'm painting, chewing on the brush that I am holding and trying to use. Yes, you are so helpful. You are so helpful. Such a good kitten. And the little edges of this don't really matter because when you mat this, the matting's going to cover all these edges, but I like to do the very edges anyway. And even though I am trying to paint right to the edge of the drawing, it's getting resisted off from the white of the crayon. So it creates that little border edge, which is part of the allure of the crayon resist technique. It creates those little white edges. I'm just touching up around my little chick shapes. And again, the aim is not to be super precise in all of these little areas. You're just giving a sense of shapes. You do not need to be exact. Alright, and you can see that some areas in here are a little darker, and that's good because it gives a sense of shadows. Maybe I'll just put a little more along here. It gives a sense of the natural wear and tear of a working farm. Alrighty. So again, this area up here and this area down here, we did wet on wet, which means I took a clean brush, I got it wet with water, and I painted the whole area wet with water, and then I added in some color so that the color could blossom and swirl wherever it wanted to go, and that creates these soft, gentle effects, which I like, good for the things that the eye is not really going to pay that much attention to, because we want the main part of the viewer's focus to be going to this barn area. Put that down a little more so you can see the red barn. So because the house is so dry, this is already starting to dry, but I would not want to try to paint in those chickens right now, because wet on wet causes colors to spread, and if I painted in here and managed to touch my brush over to the wet part, the color I was working on would spread right out into the ground area, and then I'd have billows of yellow or black or whatever color I was working with out into the ground, and that would not quite be the effect I was going after. So it's good to take a moment or two to let the existing paper dry. This is good where if you've got two different projects you're working on, you let one project dry and then you go work on the other project, and then when that project is in the drying stage you go back to the first project, and so on. But fortunately, these things dry pretty quickly in this house. Sometimes far more quickly than I want them to. So we should be able to work on the next stage in just a moment. Alright, so let's start thinking about the barn. Looking around to see if I can figure out where I put the color chart for my watercolor kit. I did not see it. Ah, that's alright. The reason I have a color chart that I made was so that I can easily tell what color all of these colors are when they dry, because the colors they are when they are raw paints that are dry is different than the color that they go on when they're wet. You know, they're pretty much the same. A green is still going to be a green, but it might be a darker green or a lighter green or a yellower green or something like that. And the color chart lets you know exactly what they're going to look like when they're dry, but it'll be fine whatever it is. So, kind of a barn color, sort of a reddish, but sort of a purplish. You know, it's not like a bright fire engine red, it's more like a purpley red. So which of these reds do I want to go with? How is that one? Is that too purpley? that might be okay. I'm just putting a bit of water onto that color to soften it up a bit. So let me talk for a minute about watercolor pre-made pans versus using watercolors in tins like I have here. So a lot of times when you're getting started with watercolors, you would buy the kits, and I don't see that I have one around right now, but the kits that have like 8 different colors, each of them in a little circle shape. Those circles just have watercolor paint in them, and that watercolor paint is the exact same paint that comes out of a tube. The only difference is that someone else pre-filled in all those circles for you with their little tubes of color, and they came to you dry. And it's fine that things come to you dry paint, because then you just add water and they become wet again. They can get wet and dry as many times as you need them to do that. So the upside of buying a preset tin of paints is that someone else has already put the paint into the tins for you and you can just get started. The downside is if you really like a particular color, like if you really like the green and you use the green a lot, then once that green is empty, you're stuck. And you have to go buy an entirely new tin because now your color set is incomplete. It's missing the green. And also, if you don't like the green they supply, if the green they supply is super bright green and you prefer to do a softer green, then you're also sort of stuck because you just get the colors that they provide to you. So while I used to use those kinds of watercolors quite a lot, what I switched to is I bought this on Amazon, but you can buy them anywhere. Bought it empty. And then I bought a bunch of different paints, and I decided on the paints that I would like to use, that I tend to like a lot. And I put the tube paint into here because it's squishy inside the tube, and you squish it out and it goes in here and then it gets dry and hard. So now if I ran out of medium yellow, I could just squish some more medium yellow into that spot, and this tube lasts quite a while, and I could just buy another tube if I ran out of it. I don't have to throw away the whole tin because each of those things is refillable. Like this one here, this blue is empty now, so I have to go find the tube for that and put some more blue back into there. So once you start watercoloring for a while, it's a good idea to get yourself an empty tin, get a bunch of colors that you like, and then you can fill it up, and that way when you run out of a particular color like that blue, you just fill that blue back up again and you can still keep painting with the whole set that you've got. And if you only use this yellow a little bit, then maybe you only refill that once every 5 years or something, but you still have it available for the times that you want to use it. So it's a cost-effective and simpler way to do watercolor painting if you're working with colors that you love and that you can easily refill when you need to. Alright, so I'm going to get my brush wet. I'm going to dab a little at the moistened red over here, and I'm going to paint in the barn. Alright, now that I put it down, see, this is why I use the cheat sheet. That's looking a little too purpley. Alright, how about this one? Oh, that looks better. Alright, we'll use this one over here instead. Oh, that looks better. Alright, so we are now doing wet on dry. And with wet on dry, the paper is dry. So this color that I'm putting down now is not spreading or going anywhere. It is staying exactly where my brush puts it. So you have more control over it, but also it loses some of that soft, flowy feel to it. Now all of these edges in the actual real-life barn have white trim around them. So the crayon here not only creates a pretty artistic effect, but is historically accurate. That's the way it actually looked. It had those white edges on the piece. So I'm painting the edge areas first. And I'm not going too close to the source lines because I like those white edges. The edges are part of what I want to have in this image. And I'm trying to paint around the tripod and paint without turning and twisting the piece of paper too much, so this is a little awkward for my hand. But we will get there. Alright. Let me see what the doors are just solid red in here. Normally I would turn this all upside down to work in an area like this, but that is alright. We got the little section of the cupola up here. Oh, actually the top roof area was supposed to be gray. Alright, so if you need to erase something, you can do it if you're fairly quick when it's still wet. So I cleaned off the brush so there's no more paint on it, and then I dry it a little so that it's now dry and it acts sort of like a vacuum. So I am just, with a damp, clean brush, I am trying to suck up the water and therefore the paint in just this little top area. So I suck it up a little, and then I'm just using my fingers, or you can use a paper towel, to squish off the water that you just lifted up. So you put it back down again and it's dry again, dry and clean. And you can see I pretty much lifted off, suctioned up color in that roof area so I can make that gray later. And I can try to do the same thing. So I'm cleaning the brush so it's nice and clean. I'm drying it so that it is clean and damp. And I'm going to brush over this area here where the blue came down across my crayon line and got into my trim area. So I am trying to sort of gently scrape away this blue by making it wet again and then dragging it up into the brush. So the brush acts like a wick to suck up the water and therefore the color. This would probably not work if you painted something dark black, because that black would stain the paper, but for something that's nice and light like this light blue, yep, that got most of it up. So it's not a blue splotch in there anymore. Alright, so the barn door over here. Get a little more red back in, so back to the painting of the barn doors. I'm going to make the doors just a slightly darker color, and I'll do that by putting slightly more paint down, just so they stand out a little bit. Alright, and then this side barn over here is the same color red. The roof is gray, so I do not want to paint the roof red. And again, it has white trim everywhere, so the white crayon resist style is working quite nicely for that. Got the door. The bigger barn doors. post if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer questions. Let me know what you're working on. Alright, let's do this side of the barn over here. This goes up into the tree. I find painting to be very relaxing. I generally paint scenes that I find to be enjoyable, so just the fact that I'm looking at these farm scenes is relaxing to me. And then I find it fun to create. So it's a fun process for me to work on them, and then it's nice to think that other people might enjoy looking at them once I am done making them. Alright, so if you look at the picture, you can see that some areas are lighter and some areas are darker. So a darker area you can put on a second coat, and because a lot of the sense of lightness of a watercolor painting comes from the light going through the paints, bouncing off the white paper and then coming back out at the eye, the more layers of paint you put on, blocking the light from getting to the paper, the darker it's going to seem, because it's not going to have as much light glowing through. So you can also make things darker by maybe adding in a little more purple to the color or doing things like that. But also know just putting multiple layers of the exact same color down will make it darker and darker, because you are blocking light from getting to the paper and it can't bounce out. It also gets less and less glowy for the same reason, because you are blocking the light from getting to that paper. So different things to play with, and try and see which way suits what you're trying to achieve better. So I know people who work with watercolors who make paintings that have 70 or 80 layers of color on them, as I sit there and tweak and make one area a little darker and then one area a little more colored, a little more purple or a little more blue, or whatever they're aiming for. If an area is a little more in shadow, you can add a little more paint there. Hello kittens. You guys being a little excitable this morning? There's plenty of places for everyone to sit. It is all right. Good kittens. Good kittens. Alright, let's put a little more paint up here. These windows, can't really tell from my picture if they are red. I think they're actually a darker blackish color. So they put in a little bit of darker brown onto them. There we go. It's a little more what they are. Alright. Alright, so now we have the basics of the barn. I want to just give that a minute to dry before I work on any roof kind of area. this might be dry enough to put the chicken colors in. I can make them dark brown and black. Maybe I can have one be white. Well, I'm not sure on the white idea because we've got all these white accents in the barn. I think maybe dark brown. Make two of them dark brown and one of them black. Again, the idea is not to be super precise here. We are not portraying the anatomy of a chicken, just to give little chickeny shape ideas. Alright, and I suppose while I've got that grayish black on here, I will put the roof in. If you end up getting hairs or brush hairs on your painting, don't worry, they will just brush off at the end. So there's no reason to really worry about them. Since I have the cats climbing over me so much, I end up getting all sorts of hairs on here, and then just take care of them at the end. Alright, we got the roofs on. A little hitching post. Alright, trees. Tree has a brown trunk. It's a brown trunk back here. Alrighty. So then the question is, what color do we want to make the trees? One benefit of doing paintings versus being a photographer is that you can change the scene to be whatever way you want it to be. So you can make the trees be summertime green, or you can make them be spring trees with all of the lighter spring colors, or you can make them autumn. And I tend to be an autumn type of person, so I like autumn colors. And while normally kittens are making strange noises. Normally while I might use red in that sort of a scene, we already have the barn, which is all quite red. So I think I might go with more of an orangey color. And you can see in the picture it was taken in late autumn, and that we've got the green from the pine trees and the brownish orangey of the falling leaves. So I'll make this one an orangey color, I think. I'm not going to make it solid orange, because usually if you look at a fall tree, the light hits the leaves in different ways when it dapples it. So we'll make some of them orange, some of them more of a crimson. Few of them a little bit of greenish. Not all of them have changed yet. A couple of them a little reddish. All right. I'll let that dry a little, and then I'll add in a little more orange, I think. Watercolor paints dry lighter than you put them down, so often you need a couple of layers to get to the darkness that you want. I'm going to put a little bit of water on its tree area, because this tree is up close and I want it to be a little less in focus, so that it doesn't distract too much from the barn scene itself. Okay. Give that a sense of dappled leaves. And having different shades gives you that different dimension, that some of them are in the light, some of them are in the shadow. If you don't have different colors right in your palette, you could easily mix them up. Just get a little orange or a little yellow, whatever colors you happen to have available to you, and you should be able to create pretty much any intermediate color from some combination of what you've got. Alright, so we've got general sense of leaves, dappled light coming through them. Alright, so now I don't want to work on the green lower part yet, because that would then have a risk of running into the wetter orange part. There we go. Alright, let's put in some yellow chicks. So just cleaning the brush again. So again, we're not doing a study on chick biology, we're just putting little bright dots of yellow, which hopefully to most people will represent little baby chicks. Alright, what else? The windows need to be a little darker, so to make things darker we add on a different layer. Add on a layer of gray this time. A little darker than that. There we go. If we look at the roof, there's a little bit of shadow that's being cast there by the other roof. So if we wanted to add that in, Put some little slats for there. Put in the antenna. A wind vane. It's probably a wind vane, not an antenna. Maybe darken out that hitching post a little bit. Yeah, and you think, do I really want the shadow of the roof? Does that add anything, or is that just distracting? I think that might be more distracting than adding anything in this particular representation. So I'm going to smooth that shadow back out again. Part of the beauty of watercolors, you can try something, say, did that work the way I wanted it to work, or does that really just end up being a distraction? Well, so now it's still a little bit darker there, so it sort of achieves both ends. Alright, and now the lower dark green area might be safe enough from the other wet areas that I can try to work on that. How is that green? Yeah, that'd be a good green for pine trees. Yep. Got the green of the pine trees. And again, the focus of this picture is not the great pine tree branch, it's the barn, so while you want to be able to see it, you don't want it to be the thing that overwhelms the entire image. So it's all a balance. The main feature of this image should be the barn. Alright, it's a little dicey when we get up here to where the pine tree crosses over this tree. Alright, I'll try to draw some branch lines in here. So again, the idea is just give a rough idea of tree in there. It is not a meditation on the power of that tree. The tree is just there to provide a little side interest. And I mean, it's in the actual scene, so we didn't even invent it. It's part of the image that we are portraying. Well, things will then dry. And then we could come back and add another layer, and then come back and add another layer, and so on and so on. But that in general is how the technique of crayon resist watercolor works. So to summarize again, to get the base image off of the photo and onto this piece of watercolor paper, we used tracing paper, which is very thin paper. We laid that over the top of the photo and we traced it so that we had a starting image of what it was going to look like. We then used graphite paper to transfer that image off of the tracing paper and down onto the destination paper, so we had a starting set of lines to work with. We then used white crayon to trace over those lines to create the crayon resist aspect of this painting, so that it had these areas that the crayon was down on that the paint would not get on top of. We used wet on wet, which is we painted this area in with water, and then we dabbed in paint so that the paint would spread throughout the water area and make this nice dappled effect in the sky and in the ground. And we went around the spaces for where we're going to put in little chickens. And then we did wet on dry, which is where we left the barn areas dry, and we painted on it with wet paint so that we had a little more control about where the main featured areas were. And now, if we wanted to, we would spend a couple more hours adding different layers of the paint to add different shadowed areas and different light areas. But this gives you a general sense of how the process works and what crayon resist is all about. And why would you think about using that? Because it creates these white boundary lines, and especially in a case like this where the barn actually had white trim, it works out perfectly. So ask if you have any questions about how crayon resist watercolor works, or how tracing paper and graphite paper work. And I'm happy to answer questions.